the Q&A feature within Google Meet. To access this feature from a computer, please click on the grid shape in the toolbar on your screen. If you're using a mobile device, select the three dots first, then select the icon with the three shapes. You should then see a Q&A feature identified by a question mark icon. To ensure your questions are anonymous, our moderators will be monitoring the Q&A for questions and capturing them throughout the evening session. Once you see that your question has been removed from the Q&A, that means that your question has been successfully captured by our moderators. You do not need to resubmit your question. We will make every effort to respond to your questions toward the end of the session. In addition, we will use your questions to update the FAQ portion of our website.
Si necesita ayuda en español, por favor envíe un correo electrónico a studentassignment@wcpss.net y alguien se comunicará con usted mañana.
In addition, we are asking that you contribute to the larger community discussion related to this initial discussion on calendar changes via Thought Exchange. The Thought Exchange will remain open through April 5th. After it closes, we will summarize the feedback received and share the summary with the board during their Facilities Committee meeting on April 14th. No one will be personally identified in the summary. Before I turn things over to Susan, I would like to remind you that today's session will focus on Briar Creek Elementary, Carpenter Elementary, Marsville Elementary, Pleasant Grove Elementary, and Sycamore Creek Elementary. By the end of this evening's session, you will have had an opportunity to briefly review the process for recommending calendar changes, extensively review the schools in your area that may benefit from a calendar change, quickly review the timeline for the planning process, and perhaps most importantly, submit your questions that will help you and our planning team to gain a better understanding of the potential impacts of a school calendar change for your family. And now I will turn things over to Susan Pulliam.
Melissa, thank you so much for welcoming everybody and giving us our sort of update on where we are and how, what brought us all together here today. And a special thank you to all of you on the call. I think there's some school staff, even maybe as principal or two, that have joined us. We really appreciate you giving us a little bit of your time this evening so that we could have this discussion and, more importantly, get to your questions. I'll show you how we're going to do the questions in just a moment. If you're just now joining us, I see some of you are using the raise the hand feature. We won't be using that in tonight's session. To provide some context, on March 10th, staff members shared an initial discussion on the topic of calendar change with the Facilities Committee of the Board of Education. The discussion centered on possible recommendations for the 2028-29 school year. So none of these recommendations would be for the coming school year or even the school year that follows. To clarify, however, at this point, no specific recommendations have been made. We're still in the exploratory and feedback gathering phase, and that's why this session is so important. Um, just for this information that we're sharing tonight, along with the entire planning process, can be found on our website here. If you'll emphasize step 6 or even go directly to this particular website, you'll be able to find all of the information specific to this particular conversation about the potential for calendar conversion. Again, if you are just now joining us, we wanted to let you know we're using the Q&A feature in the Google Meet to capture your questions. So if you're on a computer, you want to look for this grid shape on your toolbar, and then you'll click on the Q&A icon. If you're using a mobile device, you'll need to click on this sort of 3-dot image first. Then you'll look for an icon that has 3 shapes. I believe it's a triangle, a circle, and a square. and ultimately you're looking for this Q&A feature. Once you've entered your question into the Q&A feature, our moderators will be working to capture those questions so that we can address those later in tonight's session. Once you see that your question has been removed, that lets you know we have successfully captured it. And then that way we're keeping all of your questions anonymous. We are working to get to the end of the session as quickly as we can so that we can start addressing all those questions. But don't hesitate to ask the questions throughout the presentation, or if you have one top of mind right now, go ahead and post it. We'll start collecting those now. Another important feature of our feedback collecting process is our thought exchange, and we just and continue to encourage you to participate in that thought exchange. It is the best forum for posting your public comments because not only can you see all of the comments and rate them, board members can see those comments and review all the ratings that are in them, and the planning team can see every single one of those comments. So it's a really helpful tool for us to gather all of our information in the same location. Y otra vez, si necesita ayuda en español, por favor, envíe un correo electrónico a studentassignment@wcpss.net y alguien se comunicará con usted mañana. Before we jump into the specific considerations for your region, we thought it would be a good idea to just quickly let you know how we got here. How did we get to the point where this list of schools is being considered for perhaps, maybe, possibly a calendar change? We have a six-step planning process that we follow, particularly in the Office of Student Assignment as we think about near-term and long-range planning arrangements. Each year, however, we start with an update to the annual student enrollment forecast. And so that typically happens in February of each year. This year it happened in March. Then we move into looking at how that information lets us kind of get a lens into the next year's crowding. We also look at what's going on with the capital improvement plan, which new schools might be coming online, which new schools might not be coming online, which renovations might be adding capacity to some schools, and those sorts of things. So we take all of that into consideration, and then we develop our annual enrollment plan. So for the 26-27 cycle, we've already completed steps 1 through 5. The fifth step is once that the plan is approved, we start looking at schools that are severely overcrowded or capped to determine if they either need a cap or need to remain capped. And then we enter into the last phase of the process. Schools that might need assistance that could not have been provided through that annual enrollment plan or through the capping process based on their utilization rates. And that's what brings us here today. So this really is the final step of the 26-27 planning cycle. However, all the recommendations that we may make in this particular space are right now not projected to take effect until the 28-29 school year. And so you can see here how we've kind of gone through those first three portions of this process. We've looked at the cap schools, we've looked at the crowded schools, and now we're looking at the underutilized schools. So just to give you an update, I mentioned that the forecast for last year's planning cycle or for the 26-27 process was posted in February, and we've since had a review. So we thought we would give you the updated information. Our updated enrollment forecast shows a much slower growth rate where we were originally predicting a much higher growth rate. So it's just information that helps us to plan long range. For the near term, the projections are kind of holding where they've been around the 160,000 mark for total students being enrolled in the district. And while this is helpful to know for budgeting purposes and general long range planning, what's really helpful in context of these types of conversations is where is that growth projected to distribute itself across the county. So we're still a growing county. We're still seeing families move into the district from other areas. And so what we're looking at now is where might they move. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail as it pertains to your specific area, but it lets you see that those sort of blue arrows pointing in the up direction indicate where we project long-term growth over the next 10 years. And the smaller red arrows let you know where we're seeing some stabilization. Perhaps the areas are built out. Perhaps families maybe are staying in their homes a little bit longer. Sometimes you might hear the term aging in place. So they're not generating as many students as frequently as they once did, maybe when they were brand new developments and subdivisions. What you can see on the left is what that projection looked like around this time last year. And what you see on the right is the updated projection reflecting more modern and recent trends. We have lower birth rates in the state. We're seeing less in migration, particularly from foreign born families. And so those are just changing the rate of growth. We still are going to have growth, and it's still roughly going to be in the same areas that were originally projected. It just won't be nearly as at fast a pace as it has been over the last probably 10 or 20 years. Oh, good. I see some people are posting questions. That's awesome. Continue to post your questions as we go through tonight's presentation. As I mentioned, the second step in our process, and again, these are updated. So last year's maps looked a little bit different, but we start looking at what the projected crowding is going to look like for next year. So in the images you see here, these are recently updated to reflect the projected crowding for the 26-27 school year, which is a piece of information that we can use as we continue our long range planning. Again, we'll look at these in much more detail specific to your region in a few moments. We're still in the early phases of our capital improvement process. I believe the board is expected to review and consider a final approval of an updated version of the capital improvement plan at their next board meeting. As of now, the schools that you see highlighted in green on the top map are schools that opened up this school year and now have students and are operating. The school here in orange that you see is this Hilltop Beadmore Elementary, which is going to open for the 26-27 school year with its own students. And then the other schools you see circled in the dark gray or black circles toward the upper part of that map are the schools that are in the future years. The lower map then reflects where renovation projects are happening. Major renovation projects are happening across the county. And again, that orange circle that you see here is for Swift Creek, and that's a school that will be able to move into its renovated facility in time for the 26-27 school year. We'll look at, again, these in a little bit more detail for your area. For the public engagement of the annual enrollment plan, that has actually already started. So some of you may have participated in our Morrisville High School conversation that we held at Panther Creek High School a couple of weeks ago, or you may be getting invitations to participate in our virtual session around Morrisville High School because some of you are in that area that's going to be impacted by the opening of that school. So we've got two rounds of public engagement kind of happening at the same time for slightly different subjects. The other thing that I mentioned earlier was that the next step right before we get to this part where we're thinking about calendar change is, do we have some overcrowded or capped schools that need a review? What I'm showing you here is a list of the schools that are either continuing with caps or have had caps newly approved for the 26-27 school year. Those that are highlighted in green are relatively close to the area that you're in, so you might recognize the names of those schools. So again, here we are, moving toward looking at our schools that are underutilized, and most importantly, we're in the engagement process. So we have, again, made no formal recommendations to the board. We're exploring whether or not a change in calendar would truly benefit some of these schools that are maybe underutilized. We've shared this a couple of times, but just in case you joined us a little bit late, we're going to be using the Q&A feature here in the Google Meet to capture your questions tonight. So as you have questions, either right now, top of mind, or during the presentation, please post your questions using the Q&A tool, and we'll respond to those later in tonight's session. In addition, we will be using those to update our FAQ portion of our website. So we'll encourage you to continue monitoring that for any questions perhaps that we couldn't answer live tonight, because maybe they're about an area that we don't have a lot of information on, maybe academics or transportation, or perhaps it's a question you thought was really helpful. It'll be posted so you can have friends and neighbors see those responses as well. As we're talking about our underutilized schools, we just thought it'd be good to kind of set the baseline of how we sort of talk about schools in our district when it comes to crowding. So, CAP schools are schools that are identified as schools that have a restricted enrollment that's approved by the board. So, it's a specific number that have, because those schools have exceeded sort of what the classrooms and the classroom capacity were designed to support at the school, to a point where program service and delivery could potentially be compromised if we continue to add students to the school. Generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, if a new family moves into the base attendance area of that school, they do have the possibility of being sent to a different school if there's not enough seats in their student's grade or at the school for their student. In some cases, and in your area, there are a handful, particularly like Cedar Fork or Northwoods, where they're very, very close to their total cap number, but perhaps there's still room in a couple of grades. So it's always best to check with the school to determine if they're actively capping and have hit that cap number before you make any final decisions about your school assignment. Crowded schools are schools that are a little bit below that. So they're schools that are using a lot of their space. They might even be starting to get creative with how they deliver their programming. Maybe one teacher's using a cart and Finding open spaces throughout the building in the day, perhaps lunches are being staggered across multiple sessions to make sure all the students have sufficient time to eat. Carpool lines might be longer, but perhaps they're not quite yet at the point where they need to have a cap. So, our crowded schools are schools that we also like to monitor just from a capacity and facility utilization perspective. And then what brings us together tonight is a review of our underutilized schools. For tonight's conversation and for the discussion that we're having with the board currently, we're looking at schools that are operating somewhere around 85% or below. There's a handful of exceptions to this, but 85% or below are usually what we're looking at. And at that point, we start going through a whole series of reviews to determine if we can better utilize that space because we do know that it's best, for taxpayer resources and even for making sure there are sufficient programs for students if our schools are closer to 90, 95, even 100%. A couple of things to think about when we're looking at our schools and crowding and just assessing space use. At the elementary level, I'm sure all of you are familiar as you're representing five separate elementary schools tonight, that there are some class size legislation requirements that prevent us from having too many students in a particular class, particularly in grades kindergarten through third grade. In addition, we also want to look at projected growth in the area. Perhaps the school is underutilized, but there's growth and development coming, and maybe that's a good thing. We've got seats ready and available for those new students to come. I think on the previous slide, our description was it's got a school that's got room to grow. Some other things to think about that are beyond just class size. Kindergarten and first grade need to have first floor egress, being able to exit safely out of the building on the first floor without having to traverse any stairs. We have certain programs that have very specific needs. They need to have certain types of space design features or access to restrooms to be able to support a particular program, as an example. You can think about a music class needs to have a room that's got some space and perhaps some soundproofing so that it can be an effective, space for that particular class. Art, we want to make sure we have sinks and that sort of thing. Um, Other things we need to look at is if a school is particularly crowded, we might be looking at, are they converting some of their program spaces? Are they putting two teachers in one classroom to get their class size ratios down? And then, of course, those core facility impacts. Are we having those multiple lunches? Are we having to have shorter recess breaks to make sure everybody gets a turn on the playground equipment? Are we having bathroom lines that are really long? So, for tonight's conversation, we're focusing more on the underutilized schools, but this is just something to keep in mind when we're doing capacity reviews. So, when we're looking at underutilized schools, a couple of tools in our toolkit are things like adjusting the boundaries. We could potentially change the assignment area for a school to increase the total number of students that are assigned to the school. We could also leave it alone if new growth is coming. We could look at encouraging choice into the school if that's an option. If it's a calendar school that has application area, perhaps we encourage those types of applications. If it's a magnet school, we do a little bit more marketing and encourage families to take advantage of the wonderful programming at the school. If it's got trailers on the campus, maybe we could reduce the capacity of the school and make it, more efficient by simply removing those trailers. And we're certainly actively pursuing that option in many locations. And then the last sort of tool in that reducing capacity bucket would be if I have a multi-track year-round school that isn't full, perhaps it no longer needs all four tracks to be able to serve its population and could benefit from either converting to a traditional calendar or a track four calendar. So let's talk about these in a little bit more depth. So if you can kind of see here, we think of them a little bit as steps, but they're not exactly linear. So one thing we always want to look at is there projected growth in the base attendance area of the school, particularly when we're talking about multi-track year-round schools. The school is multi-track year round and it's running around 85%, yet there's new development coming and there's new students expected in the next couple of years. It might be best for us to kind of hold tight, keep the program in place, and let those seats that are available on those tracks absorb that growth as it's coming in. If there's nearby crowding, perhaps there's a school or two nearby that are actually at or above their capacity number. They might even be capped. Could it be beneficial for both schools to have an adjustment to the boundary so that the overcrowded school gets some relief and the school that's operating under 85% can take it's got room to grow, right? Can take those additional students and support those students, and then no one has to be capped or overflowed or feel really crowded in their campus. Again, looking at multi track year round schools, we could look to see if there's any mobile units on the campus. Perhaps they've just outlived the need for their mobile units, but they could sufficiently run a really effective and efficient multi track year round program within the confines of the sort of brick and mortar, is a term that we sometimes use. And then calendar optimization. So at the last sort of call is if none of those really seem to be the right option for the school, perhaps all the schools in the area are sufficient and they don't need relief. Perhaps it's in a stable area that doesn't have a lot of growth coming. Maybe it doesn't have any mobile units on its campus, or if it does, it's just a handful. We might look at calendar optimization. Is it possible that that particular multi track year round school served its purpose during a high growth period? And now that we're sort of to and through that high growth period, does it need to be multi-track anymore? Just give us that extra capacity. As a reminder, our multi-track year-round schools give us additional capacity anywhere between 25 and 33% based on the building design. And what that allows us to do is add a whole additional group of students to a school without really having to build anything or even move trailers in most cases. So if a school is at a point where it doesn't have that many students anymore and there's not growth coming and there's not nearby crowding, maybe it doesn't need to be multi-track anymore and we could be more efficient by putting all students on the same track, either track 4 or traditional, and allowing the principal and the staff to be able to more effectively distribute their resources and programs in that single track environment. The program adjustment part that you see here on the bottom of our sort of toolkit, if you will, perhaps again at a future date, maybe. Where I don't think we're there yet as a district. I know there's some neighboring districts that are dealing with this, but is the school still serving the correct purpose? Maybe it needs to provide a different service for our district, and it might be time to think about adjusting the program that's at the school. But for tonight's conversation, we're really going to focus on the calendar optimization piece. The other thing, we would just want to be open and honest. We fully understand that for the vast majority of you, you would much prefer to keep your schools operating as they are, having your multi-track year-round calendar, staying on the track that your students currently assigned to, right? Those types of things. We do understand that the vast majority of you would prefer that we not change things, as would we. From a taxpayer resources, being good stewards of taxpayer resources and being tasked by our board to think about long range planning from that lens, we do have to be honest when it's costing us more to offer these multi track year round schools when there's not sufficient student population to fill all the seats. There's a financial cost that goes into adding extra resources to the school so that it can keep delivering certain programs, even though the student population isn't quote unquote earning those months of employment. And there's a programming cost to you and to your student. You might not have access to all the same programs across all four tracks. You might have the same high quality, special electives across all four tracks because maybe substitutes are having to be used to fill in the gaps. So it's just one of those things we need to think about is what's the right fit so that your students have the best, most successful academic experience, and we're also using our resources wisely. But I also want to say I've sat on the screen for a while and you've probably seen this tag. We do recognize that perhaps out of all the options on our list, changing the calendar of a school could be the most disruptive option for both families and for staff because you're changing your family's calendar, you're changing your working calendar, you're changing sort of how your life navigates as a family. You've gotten very accustomed to these types of patterns and calendar schedules. So we get it and we do not enter into this discussion lightly, which is why we thought it was really important that we have this type of discussion with you before we make any specific recommendations. So to add a little bit to that, if we were to take a multi-track year-round school and convert it to a single track 4 school, we recognize that these are the sort of immediate concerns that pop up. Families and staff need to adjust their family routines to a different calendar. Some staff at the school may even have to have a conversation about their potential salary changes. If it's no longer operating on a 12-month cycle, some staff might have a reduced pay. They might go to 11 or 10-month cycles for payment. And so it's just something that has to be considered. The benefit of taking a multi-track to track 4, particularly if it's in an area that hasn't yet peaked with its growth and that growth is still coming, is that it does allow us that flexibility to return to multi-track year round when that growth finally arrives. The best example we have in our district currently is Lake Myra Elementary. It was opened in the Wendell Falls area in Wendell, that part of our county. It originally opened as multi-track. There was some delays in the construction and development of the neighborhood and the residential community that is now Wendell Falls. So the school was dropped to track four for a period of time to allow all of that development to come to fruition. And now that it has and is continuing to grow, the school is going to go from track four today to multi track next school year to absorb the growth. The benefit of that is the kids get to keep going to the same school, and we get that extra capacity without having to build anything or move any trailers onto the campus. So that's the best example of why we might want to take a multi-track to a track four for this type of purpose. We also know there might be some benefits just for you as a family or for the staff because you like that cycle that the year-round offers. If a multi-track year-round school were to go to traditional, those same two first features are still evident and still something that needs to be considered. But the likelihood that the school would in the future go back to being multi-track year-round is reduced. It's more likely to stay traditional from that point forward. Another conversation that we had in the district with another area highlighted too that for some of you, multi-track year-round's been around for quite a while in this region, as many as 20 or more years. It's important to continue to remind everybody that the reason multi-track year-round was used in our district was to respond to rapid growth and that class size legislation changes that sort of reduced our seats at the elementary level when that legislation was approved. So it's always been used as a capacity management tool as much as we know that people love it. They love that the trackouts give them that ability to travel. For some students, it gives them those brain breaks. But I just want to be clear that as a district, for us, it's really a tool for managing enrollment growth. All right, so let's talk about the schools in your particular area, and I'm going to continue to highlight this word may. We're only talking right now about schools that might possibly, potentially benefit from a calendar change. No actual recommendations have been made at this point. In this area, there are 5 schools that have brought you all to join us here today: Briar Creek, Carpenter, Morrisville, Pleasant Grove, and Sycamore Creek. What you're seeing here, highlighted by the orange arrow, is the current level of crowding for the schools, which is at or below 85% on the multi track year round calendar. And this does include the use of trailers. And you can see on the left, some of them have these double asterisks. That lets you know that a handful of the schools do have trailers on their campus as well. If you were to look at this column, this lets you know if they were to stay multi-track but simply remove the trailers, what the crowding would look like, right? So that kind of gives you an idea of what that perspective might be. If we were to convert any of these schools to either track four or traditional, you see those crowding implications change in these two columns. So as you can see, for some of our schools, if they were to go to a traditional or track four, even with their trailers, they might actually be overcrowded. So this is something for us to think about. Would this need to come with your reassignment? Would it be better to try to find areas to reassign into these schools if they're available? So we want to just have an open dialogue tonight before we get to the point where we're making recommendations. The other point of information that we thought was really helpful, and we shared this with the board at the facilities committee meeting, is over the last 5 years, what has the trend of enrollment looked like for these schools? So although Carpenter is, project is currently at 84.5 and would look like they're 101% crowded if they were to convert to a single track just right now in this very moment, they have had a loss of almost 23% of their total enrollment over the last several years. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. But you'll see an anomaly. Briar Creek has been growing. So there's a lot to talk about in this region before we get to the point where we're making any recommendations to the board. I told you we would talk about how the projected growth is impacting your area. So let's look at that. Let's zoom in. The areas that we're highlighting, the arrows kind of roughly point to the locations of the campuses. We're looking at, Sycamore Creek, and we're looking at Briar Creek. We're looking at Pleasant Grove. We're looking at the Carpenter and Morrisville campuses that are very proximate to each other. And you can see that the projected enrollment growth around these schools has stabilized. So we're at a point where the rate of growth is going to slow. The total number of students will either hold the same or continue to drop a little bit. You're also seeing that there is still some growth projected in the area, and we need to be mindful of that. However, that growth is being offset a little bit by the stabilization in some other areas. So, as we balance those two things out, does that mean the schools will keep their current enrollment? Does it mean they'll grow just a little bit more? Or does it mean that some schools, based on where they're located and what their attendance areas, will start to drop? So, again, a lot to consider in this region. When we're looking at elementary school crowding projected for next year based on those near-term projections, let's zoom in again. You can kind of see the impact here. We have a handful of schools that are running, well below 100%. If they're at that darker color, so you're still seeing a Cedar Fork over here. I believe this is kind of style off the screen. You've got Hortons Creek, which is a CAP school, Cedar Fork, which is a CAP school, White Oak, which is a CAP school, Northwoods, which is a CAP school, Kingswood, which is this very small school that gets crowded real fast. However, you see a lot of available capacity in the schools kind of along this corridor. So the question becomes how many of them need to remain multi track to support the enrollment needs of this community, and or is it time to consider some reassignments to balance out the enrollment between some of these schools so we don't have some that are so severely overcrowded where some are a little bit under enrolled? When we're looking at Briar Creek Elementary, so what we're going to do first is look at the two or three schools that are kind of in the northwest, like going towards the airport and on the other side of the airport. Briar Creek Elementary, you can see that they have actually trended in an increasing direction. So the question for Briar Creek is, does it need to continue to operate on a multi-track year round? If the answer is yes, then I think it can continue to serve its population. If the answer is no, would we need to do some reassignments? When we're looking at Sycamore Creek Elementary, what we're seeing here, however, is a continuing trend to decreasing. This is known and intended. If you'll recall, Barton Pond Elementary opened up recently in this community intentionally to relieve some of the crowding because Sycamore Creek was previously capped, that Sycamore Creek was experiencing. So some of this was intentional to reduce the crowding at Sycamore Creek. That attendance area was split up a little bit and some went to Barton Pond. So some of this was intentional, and again, remembering that multi-track year-round was being used specifically to manage rapid growth. Now that that rapid growth has passed and there's sufficient capacity in the region, the question for Sycamore Creek is, do they need to remain multi-track? If the answer is no, they should be okay to move forward with their current population in their space by 28, 29, of course. Let's look at the projected crowding in the region then. There's Barton Pond Elementary and Leesville are probably the two most proximate schools to these, and you can see that they have some sufficient capacity as well. So could we redistribute any of the excess students to some of these schools, or do we keep the schools multi-track, right? So there's just, again, as I've mentioned several times, there's a lot to consider in this region. So some specific information about Briar Creek Elementary. It's currently not operating a track two and crowded, right? It has 6 mobile classrooms on its campus. There's not significant enrollment growth projected in its current base attendance area. So the size that it is, it'll probably maintain, maybe get a little bit larger. These students do currently feed into Leesville Road Middle and Pine Hollow Middle, both of which operate on a traditional calendar. So something to keep in mind if you're concerned about K-8 calendar alignment. Um, and because of what we're seeing with their just current population, if we were to take Briar Creek down to a single track or to traditional, we might need to look at some reassignments to accommodate that type of a change. When we're looking at Sycamore Creek Elementary, some specific things to consider. Again, currently not operating a track two. They do not have any mobile units on their campus. Again, I showed you on the map, no significant enrollment growth projected in their attendance area over the next 10 years. They feed into a couple of different middle schools, but all of them operate on a traditional calendar. And there is a possibility that we might need to reduce the attendance area. However, by 28, 29, it's quite possible that the stability transfers will have aged out and that the school may be able to be sufficient without a boundary adjustment. So that would be left to be reviewed. If we move over to the more Morrisville side, we're going to grab Carpenter Elementary here and look at their enrollment. You can see that they have had a steady reduction in enrollment over the last 4 or 5 years. Part of this is just due to changing residential patterns, as well as being in an area that's a little bit more insulated and potentially built out, a lot less new developments in the area. Morrisville Elementary is experiencing a similar continuous reduction, not as severe, but about a 10% reduction over time. So that's just giving us an indication, that it doesn't need as many seats as it once did to serve its current base attendance area. Pleasant Grove is a unique example. For those of you in the community that are attending Pleasant Grove, you'll probably remember for the 24-25 school year, we took a bold step and we made a major change to the base attendance area for Pleasant Grove so that Morrisville area families would have a school that was close to them but wasn't capped so that we could relieve the pressure on schools like Alston Ridge Elementary and Parkside Elementary. I'm happy to say that we've been successful in that effort, and both of those schools came off of the cap list for the 26-27 school year as a result of these efforts. However, in making Pleasant Grove year round, it was originally a traditional school. We converted it to multi track year round to support those families that came from Alston Ridge Elementary and Parkside into the school. It just hasn't filled the school up at the rate that the the models showed. So either families are still using their stability transfers at their original schools as part of it, and some of the growth in the area that was projected from the town of Cary has slowed just a little bit. We think it's still coming. It's just not going to come right away. So the question becomes, does this school need to continue to operate on a multi-track year-round calendar when it's kind of hovering around 50% at multi-track? Looking at school crowding in the region, kind of coming down into that Morrisville area, you're seeing schools like Cedar Fork, Hortons Creek, Northwoods, and Parkside that are nearby. They have all stabilized a little bit, but we still do have some crowding at two schools that are very proximate to this area. So perhaps a boundary adjustment might be a better option than changing the calendar of the school. Again, things for us to explore, and we hope to get some of those types of questions from you tonight. For Carpenter Elementary, they're only doubling on one track. So as a year multi-track year round, if you're not operating a track two, or if you're not operating at least two tracks with double tracks, those are signs to us that you just don't need all the space that that multi-track year round calendar gives you. It does have two mobile classrooms on the site, so that's something to be considered. Again, no significant growth in their current base attendance area. However, different from the schools we looked at earlier, this school goes into Alston Ridge Middle, and that school does operate on a multi track year round calendar. So that's a very important thing for us to consider when we're thinking about the calendar for Carpenter Elementary. We need to think about the impacts to track loading at the middle school, as well as that potential really unfavorable calendar alignment of a traditional elementary to a multi-track year-round middle. That does not seem to be a preferred path for families, and it's not one that staff generally recommends, but we need to be thinking about that for this particular school. And then just based on those initial assessments, it's possible that to go fully traditional and maybe even get rid of the mobile units, we might have to reduce the base attendance area. But on the other side, perhaps if we expanded the base attendance area, we could maintain the multi-track and maybe relieve pressure at nearby schools. So again, let's keep talking through that. Morrisville High School does host 5 mobile classrooms. There is, again, no significant enrollment growth projected in their base attendance area, and they also feed into the multi track year round middle school of Alston Ridge. So we have to think about all those same things about the impacts on the middle school as well as the possibility for needing to reduce the attendance area. When we're looking at Pleasant Grove Elementary, it's a little bit different. It was impacted significantly by reassignments that were approved in 23-24 for the 24-25 school year. It's not operating a track two. It does not have any mobile units. There's no significant enrollment growth in the near term for these next 10 years. And because we were waiting for the Parkside Middle to come online, we didn't adjust any of the middle school boundaries for this school. So they go to a couple of different middle schools, Alston Ridge, which is multi-track, West Cary or Leesville, which are both traditional. It is be able, this area, we just want to be genuine and honest, is likely to be impacted by the opening of Parkside Middle just because of its proximity to the campus. So another thing for us to keep in mind as we're thinking about potential calendar changes for the school. I mentioned earlier in our presentation that there is research out there that we as a district have always used multi-track year round to support capacity and to deal with rapid growth in an area where we maybe can't build schools fast enough or get trailer units on sites fast enough. And it has now become beloved, and we appreciate that. And we really want to weigh and consider that in any of our recommendations. But we thought it was important that we share with you some research that's been recently conducted that can assure you that whichever calendar your student goes to, traditional or multi track, that there are no significant differences in student performance outcomes across all subgroups, regardless of the calendar. There are many other factors that are much more significant in a student's academic performance than the calendar. Now I'm going to pause and say, Yes, for individual students and individual families, there can be very unique, specific, situations where for your child, the traditional or the multi-track makes a significant difference in how they feel comfortable coming into a space. We've heard on both sides, students with actually the exact same medical diagnosis. One might not do well with the 3 week breaks and that constant having to readjust and come back into that environment, where another student with the exact same diagnosis might actually do much better having those breaks and being able to kind of reset before they come back into that next 9 weeks. So we do recognize those individual unique circumstances, and our traditional like transfer process will always be available for families if we need to look at individual needs. If you're interested in reviewing this research, it's on that calendar conversion page. It's linked here, so you're certainly able to read that and explore that for your own purposes. Again, everything I've shared tonight is on our assignment planning page. If you go to this page, you'll see all of that information from projections to crowding to capital improvement plans, enrollment planning, the capped and crowded schools, and then, of course, today's conversation. If you want to bypass all of those first 5 steps and just look at what we're talking about right now, you can jump to the calendar conversion page, which is actually linked directly from the step 6 on the page above. So, whichever one of these makes sense to you, I would bookmark one or both of them for the next couple of months as we're going through this process. All right. We're going to get to questions soon. So before we do that, I just want to remind anybody who might have joined us midterm, if you have a question for us, please use the Q&A feature here in the Google Meet. You'll look for that. I've seen a lot of questions coming in, so I know a lot of you have discovered it, but look for these types of icons. Ultimate, you're looking for this question mark, and that'll let you post your question. We're going to keep your questions anonymous. When you see that your question has been removed, that lets you know we have successfully captured it. You don't need to repost it, and we're going to get to those in just a moment. But before we do that, I thought it would be good to let you know where we are in the process. So on the March 10th, we went to the facilities committee. We shared with them that we were going to come out and talk with everybody before we came to them with recommendations, but that we had this list of schools that we thought maybe might possibly perhaps benefit from a calendar change, but we wanted to get community feedback before we made any recommendations. Our thought exchange is open to that day and will stay open through April 5th. We're going to continue to review those. We're pulling a lot of cool questions out of that we're going to use to update our frequently asked questions section of our website, and also to inform the planning team as they take next steps. This last period here was all of our virtual sessions. So this is the third and final virtual information session that we have regarding this particular topic. We've been hosting the engagement sessions. We're going to collect that feedback and summarize and analyze it. We're going to work with the planning team to look at those unique perspectives of each community and determine what the best step forward is. And those recommendations will then be prepared and shared with the board. So the official timeline is that on April 14th, we'll go to the board at their facilities committee meeting and share with them our initial recommendations. We'll then host one more round of public engagement so that we can see how people are responding to the specific recommendations. Those of you that are staff, if your school is specifically named as a school that could benefit from a calendar change, we would then have very direct meetings with your principal will help us organize. We'll have some very specific staff conversations because we know you have very important questions about how those things might impact you personally as a staff member. Then we'll bring final recommendations to the board on May 5th after having those staff meetings and those public meetings. And then I believe that the board will probably take up for final vote on May 19th. And talking with them in initial discussions, it seems like May 19th would be a preferred date to bring those for an official vote. At that point, that might require a boundary change, we'll start looking at that for either the 27, 28, or 28, 29 enrollment plan. And then, of course, any schools that are being recommended and approved for conversion, I should say, would get a lot of support from staff on all offices to make sure that they're prepared for that transition. Melissa, I'm going to take a drink of water and turn things over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Susan. That was a lot of information. Now we'd like to address as many of your questions as possible. So please take a few minutes and post your questions or comments using the Q&A feature. And as you continue to post, we will start addressing questions that were submitted earlier during this session. As a reminder, please also do continue to contribute to our thought exchange. This is another meaningful way to engage in this discussion. All right, Susan, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
First one, can you please provide context for enrollment changes at specific schools? Rather than general growth, some specific changes are the direct result of recent assignments.
So for I think we talked about it with Sycamore Creek and Pleasant Grove. I believe Briar Creek was also involved. So Briar Creek increased its base attendance area when Pleasant Grove changed from traditional to multi-track, and Sycamore Creek had a reduction as Barton Pond opened, and that shifted some base attendance areas in the region. For Carpenter and Morrisville, nothing has happened with their base attendance areas for a significant amount of time. So theirs is just natural changes in enrollment at those two schools.
Next one, um, these are kind of general calendar option questions. Are the only options for schools the following? Keep the schedule as is, convert to traditional, or convert to single track year round? Is there an option to drop a track if your school operates all tracks?
That's an excellent question. And actually, you might have noticed that some of our schools have already taken that step where they've dropped a track. Sycamore Creek and Briar Creek currently do not operate a track two, and Pleasant Grove currently does not operate a track two. And what we're finding is that schools that are in that position, that means they're not taking advantage of the extra capacity. So being multi track is now no longer, from an operational perspective, efficient. However, more importantly, there's some programming challenges. When your enrollment is below a certain amount and you continue to stretch your students across three tracks, it gets more and more and more challenging for principals to be able to take the resources that they earn for their student population and provide full academic programming. Think about counselors, think about specials, think about even some of your special education services. It gets that much more challenging for them to stretch those dollars across those three tracks. We've heard at the middle school level in particular that in some cases a substitute might have to provide coverage for an elective if there's not enough months of employment to cover that time period. We've seen that by only having the three tracks, you might have less ability to move students around. If academically it would make sense for them to be with a different group of students, the only way to do that is to move them to a completely different track versus maybe just a next classroom. So all of these things make it that much more difficult for the principal to maintain that high level of programming that you're used to as they continue to get smaller and smaller and even reduce a track. So we do allow schools to reduce a track here and there, and usually we're doing that as a way to say, "Hey, let's hold there because maybe growth is coming." Or in cases like this, we'll sit there for a minute, but if we sit there for too long, it might be a sign that the school no longer needs to be multi-track.
Are there any year-round middle or high schools within transfer distance for these elementary schools?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Are there any year-round middle or high schools within transfer distance for these elementary schools?
So for Sycamore Creek and Briar Creek, I think the closest year-round options, and this is going to sound crazy, might be the Track 4 year-round school of Durant Road Middle because there aren't any multi-track year-round middle schools kind of in their region anymore. If you come towards Morrisville and Cary, Alston Ridge Middle is a multi-track year-round school. However, its current base really does fill it up. There's very few open seats for transfers. The next closest multi-track in this area are probably Salem, which again is getting a little bit far south towards the Apex area. So there are less and less multi-track year-round middle schools in the area.
There are several questions related to the earlier question about dropping a track. And then there's this one for the schools that feed into a multi-track year-round middle school, would you consider making one school single track, track one, and another school as single track, track four?
That's a really interesting perspective. I don't think it's something that operationally our district has considered before. As you can see, we either have multi-track schools or track four schools. We've never sort of converted from multi-track to track one or multi-track to track two, that type of thing. So that is definitely a unique perspective that we can share with the planning team for review and consideration. Um, because I get where you're coming from, the idea that if I have a multi-track year-round middle school, as sixth graders are coming in, they need to come in a balanced way across the 4 tracks so that they can continue filling that school and not have to continuously have track changes when they go to 6th grade. So that's an interesting perspective. It is not one that we have considered before.
Here's one related to projections. Are you considering the birth rate decrease during the COVID-19 pandemic?
That's an amazing question because the birth rate has continued beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, there was a little bit of a blip during COVID slash shortly after the COVID lockdown started. And then it dropped a little bit. So the birth rate has continued to be a little bit lower. And we think we're going to see even more impacts at the elementary level in this coming school year and the school year that follows in response to that dip. If you're interested in that information, our forecast has been posted to the website on step 1 of that website that I shared with you. So if you want to dig into that, all of the data and analytics that were used to develop the forecast, which include birth rates, they include in-migration rates, they include a lot of economic and demographic information to kind of compile together. We don't do it by ourselves. We do it with a partner at UNC Demography to help make sure that we're using all of the latest research and data elements to help us with those projections.
So here's one that it's a little complicated, but
Okay.
we're going to try to stick with it. Since Wake County touted calendar alignments for so long, will middle schools remain on a year-round calendar despite overcrowding? And if so, how will rising sixth graders from a newly changed traditional calendar elementary school be assigned to tracks? And can they be prioritized to their old track?
Ooh, okay. I think I'm tracking. If I understand the question correctly, number one is K-8 calendar alignment still a main focus for the district. It has been for quite some time. However, at this point, now that we're stabilizing with our enrollment and our growth is starting to be a little bit slower growth rate, we're seeing that the need for multi-track year-round middle schools is less and less. We've got enough middle school seats roughly in the district. They're not always in the right space. You're in an area, Mills Park has been capped and continues to be capped. And then Apex Friendship a little bit farther south. Those are 2 middle schools that have continued to see pressure on their campus for enrollment. So, what we're seeing more and more is that as a district, we're going to be shifting to an emphasis on a 6-12 calendar alignment so that when you get to traditional, oh, there was a question earlier, Melissa. I think you asked about a year round high school. We do not have multi track year round high schools. We've researched it. It's not something the district is really going to enter into. There are a handful that operate on that early college calendar because they have early college associations, and Southeast Raleigh High School has a modified calendar. It's one of our magnet schools. It's a specialized program. But other than that, all of our high schools operate on a traditional calendar. So, with that, it's sort of in mind, if the transition for families is going to happen between 8th and 9th grade or 5th and 6th grade, it might be one or the other. So, the calendar alignment for sure will be 6-12 if it's a traditional middle, traditional high school, or there might still be some areas of the county where we can do some K-8 multi-track, but then you'll be transitioning to traditional at the high school. As far as the track alignments and the track assignments go, I think if I understand the question correctly, let's just say we made the bold choice to take a school that's multi-track that happens to feed to Alston Ridge Middle and make it traditional. And then we'd have a traditional elementary going to a multi-track year-round middle. I'll be honest, I don't think that's something that the district wants to do, but let's just say that happens. If that happens, would my student who's going to the middle school have preference to go back on the track they were on before the conversion occurred? I would say that we would work with the principals to make sure they had all of that information so that if that actually ended up being the case, that they would be able to make sensitive decisions about track assignments for families in that situation. Ideally, I would think that would be the least preferred option, for us is to create that mismatch.
Okay, is Wake County wanting to remove year-round schools?
Wanting to, I think, is probably not the correct term. It's more that as we look at and are charged with trying to increase our efficiency, reduce our costs on things that are operations related, so we can, put more money towards things that are academic and student focused. That we would be trying to move away from using multi tracks in areas where they're not self sustaining. What we're starting to see is some of our multi tracks, if we continue to operate them below 85%, tend to require additional months of employment added to their allotments beyond what they earn for their student headcount to make their program work. And so we're taking money and putting it in a school simply to maintain a calendar versus if it were to go to traditional or track 4, it would be able to self-sustain with all of its resources because it could distribute them to the students on that one track. It's sounds complicated, and I may be explaining it in a way that makes it sound more complicated than it is, but essentially, the longer we have a multi-track school operating below 85%, the more resources we're probably going to have to add on top, which then takes away some flexibility we have to provide those resources somewhere else.
If the school becomes overcrowded, do you intend to move existing students to other schools?
So I'm going to make an assumption that we're saying, let's say we move forward with some sort of a calendar change, and then that school at some point starts to become crowded again. Would we reassign students away from the school? I think it's probably too early to answer that question because it would have to depend on the circumstances. If it's a school that converts from multi track to track 4, perhaps we simply just say, all right, we've waited and that growth has come and it's time to go back to multi track. And we simply expand tracks at the school. I mentioned earlier for some of you who may have joined late, we're doing that at Lake Myra Elementary in another part of the county going into next school year. If it's a school where maybe we said, hey, let's go traditional because all of the projections are telling us that there's no growth coming, there's no need, it makes sense in this area. Would we need to do reassignments if growth were to come again? Perhaps. I really don't know. I think it might be a little too early to give a confident answer to that question, but certainly that would not be the intention. If we think that taking one of these schools and changing their calendar is going to create a situation where 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road, we'd have to then reassign students out of the school, then that might be a sign for us to reconsider changing the calendar. Perhaps we do something else. Because certainly, no, we would not want to continuously have change for the community with the calendar change and then assignment change. Like we wouldn't want to intentionally create that type of environment. No.
When you are considering calendar changes, does it seem like traditional is a more cost effective option rather than changing to a track 4 calendar?
We've actually looked at this from a couple of different instances, and I will make sure we get a more detailed answer to this question because it's come up a couple of times, and I obviously don't work in the budget office. But it's my understanding that going to traditional or track 4 from a staffing perspective creates the same cost savings for us. What may be sort of underlying could be, I'm not sure about facilities maintenance because you've got the track outs where you're sort of in and out of the building, and does that create some extra usage on the HVAC or something that I can't understand? Or is there maybe some transportation costs because you're kind of on an off cycle for transportation? Or is it a benefit for transportation because now we're distributing the students across a couple of calendars? We've had this question asked in a couple of different ways. So we're going to get some fine tuned responses to this from the budget office, and we'll have those in time for our April 14th presentation. So I'm glad someone brought that up because that reiterates that this is an important question for the community and for the board to consider.
When is a modified year round calendar considered? It doesn't seem to be on the table here, correct?
Oh, yeah, it's not. So the modified calendar is a specialized calendar that was used in the late 90s to as a pilot, and we started it with schools like Southeast Raleigh High School, the one I mentioned as a magnet school, Partnership Elementary, Centennial Middle, Moore Square Middle, and Carver Elementary. At the time, they were the only 5 schools that had that particular calendar. That was before what some of you might hear as the calendar law. So there was a law that was passed sometime after those schools were opened that said schools couldn't start before August 25th or the Monday closest to August 25th, with the exception of a multi track year round school. So when that law was passed, it made it, I hate to use the word illegal, but it made it to where districts can no longer use the modified calendar for new schools or for schools that didn't already have that calendar in place. The small exception that the legislature did make is that if a school qualified as a restart, which is usually a school that maybe is having struggling with performance and they're given some flexibility to try some different things, a handful of those schools might be able to use the modified calendar. But other than that, a traditional normal school, we're not allowed to use the modified calendar for anymore. So that's why you don't hear it being proposed. As a person, though, I do think it's an amazing calendar.
Would you switch our school to track 4 only if the middle school is traditional? It seems like traditional is the more logical choice between the 2.
Mm. So that's great feedback, and we'll probably need to look at that school by school. In some regions, let's say the middle school is traditional, maybe the elementary school goes traditional, and you have a nice alignment, and then we have K-12 calendar alignment. In other areas, if you're so used to the multi-track and the track having that flexibility to go back to multi-track one day, perhaps maybe going track 4 would make more sense. Even though there is that transition from track 4 to traditional, it gives that particular elementary school the ability to go back to all 4 tracks if the growth returns to the area. But it is an interesting question, and we've heard it a couple of different ways. We've heard that some, you know what, let's just rip the band-aid. Let's have traditional elementary, traditional middle, traditional high school, call it good. Others are like, but we've gotten so accustomed to having the track outs. We really think it's beneficial for our population. We think there might be growth coming in the future. Maybe it would be a safer bet to go track 4 so that we have that ability to expand to multi track in the future if needed. But yeah, school by school, we do need to look at that and look at those feeder patterns. That is important. It's been clear to us that that cohort alignment is very important.
There are a couple of related questions about specific schools, such
Okay.
as multiple schools here feed into Alston Ridge Middle. If they are converted to a single track year round, what is the plan to handle crowding at Alston Ridge Middle?
Right, and I think we addressed that earlier. That's definitely something that have to be weighed and considered because that's why we brought this up. We're not sure that now is the right time for schools like Carpenter and Morrisville, but we do know that they're struggling to keep all 4 tracks full. And we definitely have to think about the impacts on Alston Ridge because you're right, we can't sustain Alston Ridge Middle if the wrong sort of arrangement of students is moving into the campus. It already struggles as it is with a little bit of a heavy emphasis on track 4. So absolutely, we would not want to do anything that puts more pressure on Alston Ridge Middle to try to move families from track 4 to track 2 or track 1 to track 3 to make sure that they can fit in the school space. Very, very important for us to consider.
Another one related to Pleasant Grove Elementary. If this was changed to a traditional calendar, how would this work with the new middle school being built? Would you change the middle school calendar as well to match?
So that thank you for bringing that up. It's important to talk about new middle schools or new elementary schools. The calendar for the school is not decided until it's time to open, and the board makes that decision at the same time that they're approving the attendance area for the school. So absolutely, any schools that might feed into Parkside Middle, knowing what their operating calendar is, would definitely be important to think about when we're drawing an attendance area for Parkside Middle and establishing a calendar for the school. So they're not wrong in thinking that whatever decisions we make in these next couple of years will certainly be important for impacting the calendar of Parkside Middle, which right now I think it's either 2030, 31 or 2031, 32 for its opening year. So there is definitely a relationship between these and that we have to be mindful of that because we do not want to create additional instability for families as that school opens related to calendar in particular.
There's some more school-specific questions.
Okay.
Would moving Hortons Creek students to Carpenter be an option if they are capped and close by?
Yes, this is definitely something we need to think about. Would boundary adjustments be the right call here? Would looking at some of the nearby perennially, over year capped schools and saying, maybe we could go ahead and adjust those attendance areas and take advantage of the space that's now available in schools that didn't used to have this kind of space. Would that be the better option for this community to maintain the calendar stability and provide relief to a nearby CAP school? So thank you for bringing that forward. That is something the planning team would definitely want to look at.
Related to Morrisville Elementary and Carpenter Elementary, this comment and question says these should not be recommended for a calendar change because there are CAP schools nearby, such as Weatherstone Elementary, which shares a boundary. Um,
So I
and
think that's
also,
similar to the previous. Oh, there's more. Sorry.
well, it's okay. Uh, you go first.
So I think that's similar to the previous question because Hortons Creek is also a CAP school, and I believe Cedar Fork and Northwoods really aren't too terribly far from this region either. So is it time now that we? Because just for context, Carpenter and Morrisville used to be really, really full, and so changing their attendance boundaries and adding students to them wouldn't really have been a successful option to relieve the nearby CAP schools. Perhaps that would be a preferred option in this community. Let the calendars stay as they are, but maybe adjust some boundaries to take advantage of these available seats. So definitely, again, similar to the question prior, this is definitely something the planning team would want to consider.
Yeah, that, and I think that answered the follow-up question, which was related to the boundaries. Could they be adjusted to relieve crowding and capping at the schools?
Yeah.
Let's see. Has the potential economic impact to the communities been considered? A lot of programs in the area have been built around track out camps.
Yeah, so we have actually heard this from a couple of different communities being concerned about those economic impacts for businesses that sort of have built themselves around supporting multi-track year round. And we find that to be a very unique and insightful perspective that's been brought forward. So we're going to make sure that we're reaching out with our town partners and if they need, and if needed, maybe a local chamber of commerce to make sure that we're thinking all of that through. We're so thankful again for community participation because that is something I'm not going to say it wasn't top of mind for the planning team, but it definitely has become something that they're considering and weighing in the final decision making.
This is a comment. It, oh, it just, sorry, it jumped on the page. It seems that changing calendars are not nearly as disruptive for families with multiple children in middle school, elementary school, and high school on different schedules.
Ah,
Um,
so maybe perhaps having alignment K-12 would provide some relief and benefit for families with students across multiple grades versus multi-track elementary, multi-track middle, traditional high school, maybe having traditional for families in that situation they could see the benefits of. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think so.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that piece.
Would all the schools on this list for the region require an adjustment or only certain number of targeted changes?
So I think it's going to be school by school. Pleasant Grove, I think certainly could support a calendar change without any boundary adjustments and then continue to absorb the growth that will eventually come to them from some of the development in their area. Briar Creek would most likely require a reduction in its attendance area. However, there are nearby schools that have sufficient capacity. So if that's something that the community would prefer, and we could support that. But I think Briar Creek for sure would require an attendance boundary change. Sycamore Creek, we're looking at it. It looks as if we wait till 28, 29 that the school might not require an attendance boundary change because there are sufficient number of students in kind of like grades 4 and 5 that are from that original stability cohort that are aging out. So it's possible that they wouldn't, but we would need to take a closer look at Sycamore Creek. Carpenter and Morrisville, it looks like probably would, just because of the nature of how they're at the 85, if not even a little bit above. So I think, yes, they probably would require a boundary change for those two schools to be able to successfully fit all the students on the campus on a single track. So something to consider. Doubly disruptive, if you will, a reassignment plus a calendar change. Is that really the ideal approach here?
So these two questions are related. How would the calendar change impact class sizes and offerings like specials? And would a change potentially mean larger class sizes?
Thank you for that. That's a wonderful perspective to sort of consider. One is that let's at the elementary level, It would actually help to stabilize class sizes because if one particular class starts to get a little bit larger, you can easily shift one or two students to a nearby class when they're doing the rostering over the summer and all of that. They could think, "Oh, this one's getting closer to 20 and it needs to be at 18, but this one's at 17. I can, because everybody's on the same calendar, we can actually regulate the class sizes better and the class sizes will be more stable and at the class size limit." And so I don't want to say smaller because all of our classes are, 18, 16, 17, 17. Fourth and fifth grade tend to be a little bit larger. We could probably reduce fourth and fifth grade a little bit because we wouldn't have to balloon them, if you will, because of the particular track that they were on. So I think you would see that class sizes would either normalize or get smaller. As far as specials and electives, I think you'll see more consistent offerings if you're on a single track because you'll have a 10-month employee that can offer that special or that elective across all of the student population without having to think about vacations and track outs. So I think you would see an improvement there as well, improved access to some of those specials and electives.
How will staffing be affected by change to traditional or track 4?
So the staffing changes, it depends on the role that the person is in. So obviously there'll be the calendar change for their family, for their work life. That part will be consistent for the staff, the same as it is for the family. From a number of positions, the school might not require as many extra positions to support all of that stretch that they have to do to make it work across under enrolled tracks. So we might be able to see them, be relieved in that way. But as an employee themselves, if it's a classroom teacher who's, functioning as a tracked teacher, so I'm a first grade teacher on track 4, the salary won't change, but perhaps the pay schedule will change. And that's just something to think about. And we can talk with the staff about that offline. If it's a 12-month employee that's specifically 12 months because they're serving a multi-track year-round school, there is a chance they could be reduced to 11 or 10 months. And so that could be, I mean, that is essentially a salary reduction in the sense that there's 2 months of employment. They'd go from a 12-month employee to a 10-month employee. So there could be some salary changes for those staff members. So that is something that also has to be monitored and weighed and considered.
Okay, has nearby construction, and I assume that means residential development, been taken into account?
Yes, and I think, Melissa, you can kind of back me up if I miss any pieces here because I know you know this a little bit more intimately than I do, but we partner with our municipal planners to get all of their information at least once a year, if not more frequently, to give us an update on what's happening with current constructive construction projects, permitted construction projects, as well as sort of future projects that maybe haven't been fully approved but are in the works so that we have a good idea of what types of units and how many units and when they're going to open and when they're going to start generating students. We also get from those partners what types of housing, if it's going to be a house, if it's a townhome, if it's an apartment, if it's senior living, or if it's just straight commercial, then we don't worry about that as much, right? Because that's not good, that's not housing. And then we work with them to help us look at how that will change the enrollment for the area. So part of that is what's done in the forecast, and another part of that is what's done in that spatial distribution that you saw with the arrows map, so that we can understand what might be happening in the area. So we don't come up with this 100% on our own. We absolutely rely on our partners to help us, and we have amazing partners. I want to see if I can show that map so that you can see that's where this information comes from. We'll zoom in here. So that's where you're seeing some of these larger arrows. That's because those are areas where new construction is coming and projected within the next 10 years. If it's outside the 10-year window, we don't track it quite so tightly, but we keep it in mind.
On a different topic, my kindergartner is in a class with 18 children. Is this considered underutilized?
18 is right on. So kindergarten classes are supposed to be at a 1 to 18 ratio. First grade is supposed to be 16, and then second and third grade are supposed to be 17. Fourth and fifth do not have a legislated class size. I think we try to keep them at least around 24, but I know it's sometimes in a crowded area they can get closer to 30. That's not ideal. We know that. There might even be a handful of exceptions where they're a little over 30, but we do try to keep them somewhere in that 24 to 28 range when things are ideal. And that's where, if you'll like flattening the tracks could help, because if all of the students were on the same track, track 4 or traditional, then you could adjust those a little bit better. But yes, 18 is not underutilized. 18 is for that particular room would be ideal.
I think you've already touched on this, but maybe it's asked a little differently. Will the decisions be made school by school? It looks like the situation is pretty different across schools we're discussing.
Yes. Yes. Recommendations will be made school by school. We've just brought you together as a region because of how the domino impacts might be for this type of conversation. But absolutely, we're going to look school by school at what's the best fit for that particular site.
Is community feedback really going to be considered, or is it a done deal regardless of what we think?
Absolutely, and that's why we were very intentional this year about doing this process early on, is we really wanted to hear these unique perspectives. As I've shared with you, there's some ideas that have come up that, the planning team can't consider without input from the community, like the economic impact, or perhaps, what type of calendar alignment is really favorable for families region by region? Is it K-8? Is it 6-12? Is it K-12? So yes, absolutely the feedback is impacting the planning team. I've seen them kind of go back to the table. No, as we've mentioned, and I know people don't always believe us, but literally no recommendations have been made. We're just at the phase right now where it's like, could these schools benefit from a calendar change? Because if we're going to make a calendar change in 28, 29, we need to decide now. But if it's not ready, if 28, 29 is just too soon and the area could benefit from some other approach, like an assignment boundary change, maybe some trailer removals, then maybe we try that approach first and we pause and we think about this at a future time.
Do parents have the option to vote on traditional versus track 4 options?
So we don't really take votes because we don't want to pit families against each other. What we do is we look at the feedback that is shared. We look at all of the perspectives, like the calendar alignment at the middle school, whether or not there's growth coming in the area, and we make a recommendation. If that recommendation goes against what a portion of the community would prefer, you'll have the option to respond to that after we make the recommendations. But ultimately, we understand that there's always going to be opposite sides. So we're just going to try to make the best recommendation possible, including the feedback that's been received. But no, we don't necessarily poll or take votes.
Right, there are quite a few questions related to Sycamore Creek,
Okay.
and it seems to be a pretty wide range. Our school, Sycamore Creek, will be over capacity by 27% if these changes are made. What's the rationale?
Right. So this is an area where we're seeing that the student population is a certain size today, but every year the cohort keeps changing. So that every incoming kindergarten class is smaller than the one that was before it. So what you're seeing today, 25, 26, is very different from what will be at the school by the time we get to 28, 29. But again, we're going to continue to monitor those projections, validate those projections before we make any final recommendations. But the reason Sycamore is being considered is because it looks by the time we get to 28, 29, there'll be sufficient capacity in the building to operate on either single track or traditional.
This a comment, I think you just answered part of the question, but it just says Sycamore Creek looks ready to go traditional. Why wait so long?
Yeah. And we've heard that in a couple of other communities is like, if this is going to happen, why do we wait for 28, 29? So we've been working with our board really closely on this particular process over the last couple of years. And because of the financial impacts, because of the impacts on pre-scheduled vacations, because of how disruptive changing your family's school calendar can be on how you operate your life. The board asked us to really consider making sure that we made these decisions 2 years in advance, so families and staff had plenty of time to prepare any changes they would need to, maybe for before and after school care or daycare purposes, perhaps those track outs that we've been talking about. For staff, do they want to look at maybe a placement at a different school if they would prefer to maintain a particular salary point? Principals, thinking about how they're going to reorganize their staff and reorganize their structures in their buildings, how they're going to reorganize their special schedule or their lunch schedule or their carpool schedule, all of those types of things. So that's why we're talking about it 2 years in advance. That's not to say that The board couldn't ask us to expedite any one of these and do them earlier, but we're just following their guidance right now and trying to get 2 years in advance.
Is Sycamore Creek still using waitlisting students whose homes were not purchased before 2016?
Actually, no, their cap was removed a couple of years ago. So now anybody who moves into the base attendance area can go to the school. And that's been true for, I want to say, at least 2, if not 3 years, because
Um,
Barton Pond relieved it sufficiently so it was able to take their cap off.
would Sycamore Creek be at risk for capping or being overcrowded?
Again, based on the current enrollment projections and the growth projections for this region of the county, we don't perceive that there would be a spike in enrollment, but we're going to continue to look at that data and evaluate it before making a specific recommendation. I do want to mind us it's 7:22, and we promised everyone we'd give them their day back at 7:30. So let's try to go fast. I'll talk faster.
Okay, okay. Um, I know the research says traditional and year-round are equitable, but special needs students are understudied in this area. Um, I think this needs to be acknowledged.
Okay.
Even the articles cited um, acknowledge that, and it's important information for families of special needs children.
Thank you for bringing that forward. We'll definitely share that back with the team as well as any future partners in research.
I'm just trying to get to as many of these as possible. Have you researched how much the changes reduce Wake County public school systems enrollment and versus what the projected savings are? For instance, leaving for charter or private.
As a district, we do monitor that. If you are interested, there's a full accounting of that in that projections report in step one that I was telling you about earlier. So I'm going to pop that website up again real quick. Um, So if you'll go to this website and look at step one, you'll see all of the information there. Yes, we do monitor what's happening with charter enrollments from the area, homeschool, private school. So yes, we do monitor those impacts. In this particular region of the county, it seems to be relatively stable. So whatever impacts have happened and increased over the last several years seem to have stabilized. But yes, we do monitor that very closely. And if it does reduce the total number of students we're asked to serve, then we just need to think about what that means for our operations.
If we have to go to a traditional calendar, will we be given an option for a transfer to a year-round school?
We get that question a lot, so I absolutely think that's something that needs to be considered and offered. Certainly, we need to be mindful of our bus driver shortage and offering transportation to these options. But I know that at the very minimum, there's always going to be the opportunity to put in a request for transfer based on your particular hardship reasons to ask for whatever it is that you'd like. And if it meets the standards and the policy, it can be approved. But specific to this type of change, I absolutely think that the board would prefer that we come up with a specific plan to support families who are trying to stay on multi-track if for some reason their school goes traditional. I know, for example, there was a middle school that converted from multi-track to traditional, so we were more lenient for those students that were at the school. If they asked for a nearby multi-track middle school and we had seats, we tried to approve those where we could, just as precedent, as history.
So let's take one more question. Um, there's some concern for year-round teachers. Would they potentially lose jobs going to a traditional calendar? Um, and can you talk about the efficiency and the impact on teachers?
So, generally speaking, teachers themselves should not be displaced because the students they're serving today, they would still be serving in the future. They just be doing it on the same calendar. That's not to say that might not be 5 months or 10 months of employment worth of savings by reducing to a single track that might happen, but we will work with principals on that. I mentioned at some point, I'm not sure if this viewer heard it, If a school is specifically recommended to have a calendar change that would impact staffing, we will then follow up with one-on-one conversations with those schools and their staff, and we'll bring some teams out with us from like human resources and others so that we can specifically address those questions for teachers to make sure that they are assured in what will come. And again, this is part of that 2-year window. So they have lots of time to think about what these impacts might be for them and for their family before making any specific decisions related to their employment. So we definitely want to be as supportive as possible to staff if their school ends up going through a calendar change. And we've got some practice with it. We've done it a couple of times already.
Thank you, Susan.
Mhm.
And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We hope the session has been informative and that you have a better understanding of the process used to determine which schools may benefit from a change in school calendar and improve overall school utilization. We appreciate your open and honest participation, and your input and feedback is vital and will assist the planning team as we develop official recommendations. Remember, we will present a summary of the feedback received and any recommended calendar changes to the board at their facilities committee meeting on April 14th, with a final vote expected in May. The thought exchange will remain open through April 5th. We encourage you to continue to post comments, rate comments, and explore the exchange. Please continue to monitor your email and the district website for information about upcoming events and updates to the FAQ section on the calendar change and enrollment pages. Again, thank you, and we hope you enjoy the remainder of your evening.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.